You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is Thursday, February 13th, 2025 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific time. And I've been getting a lot of inquiries lately about how does the ideal parent figure protocol actually work? And so I thought I would talk a little bit about that. And particularly through the lens of the meditation aspect of it and our long goal, of course, which is classical enlightenment. How does that all figure into this conundrum of doing a dopey meditation a few times and then changing your whole underlying attachment system as a result of that? Uh, I think it's important to also say that it is a three-pillar approach, which means that ideal parent figure alone won't result or really produce the results of shifting your attachment strategy. You need to do the other two pillars. One is the mentalizing and emotional regulation pillar, and one is the psychoeducation around how secure relationships are supposed to function. If you grow up in a household where you have uh, access to people who function securely, then you witness the way that they operate relationships and you learn the skills there. But if you grow up in an environment of insecure, disorganized attachment, what you learn are the dynamics of insecure and disorganized relationships. And if you attempt to repeat those, even if you do earn security, you'll have the same types of outcomes with them. And so understanding the game plan or the structure of secure functioning relationships is paramount to being able to enter into them. And in fact, if you understood the dynamics of secure functioning relationships, you could negotiate secure functioning relationships and leave your native attachment strategy insecure, disorganized, and still be able to do that. The long goal, of course, is to complete the whole operation so that you can function in an automatic way, in a secure way, and not have to rely on a cognitive structuring of relationship dynamics. The thing about relying too heavily on a cognitive structure for relationships is that when you get really stressed, of course, your cognitive mind goes offline and you're just back to the perceptual database that creates the meaning associated with reality. And you could easily slip back into the tactics of insecure, disorganized attachment and enact those instead of the secure ones and then have to repair. There's a lot of catch up in the dynamics of negotiated secure functioning relationships without doing the deep work. But it also depends on your partners, and it's usually somebody who's dissatisfied with the quality of their life that comes to um, do this work, and the people who are satisfied in the way that their native attachment strategy works and their native relational systems work don't see the point of putting the effort into actually changing everything. Um, so one of the things that happens when you begin to change your uh, fundamental attachment orientation is that all of the relationships that you've devised with your insecure, disorganized attachment strategy need to be renegotiated in some sense. And not everybody's willing to do that because the people who think that the relationships are working just fine are usually the person in the relationships whose needs are being met. It's usually the person whose needs aren't being met who wants to renegotiate. So that's how that goes. But when you look at the way that we construct reality, that's really what we're talking about here. We have this perceptual database, and what I mean by that is It's sort of the reservoir of a lifetime of conditioning, and we mainly operate on the basis of meaning rather than on the basis of what happens. We Shinzen used to talk about this Brownian motion of gathering sense data around us through all of the different sense gates. And then there's an automatic process of evaluating that. So you curate the sense data that you gather. One of the things about that is it's just not a random survey of what's actually happening. You have preferences of meaning, and you tend to look for, this is of course all unconscious, you tend to survey the environment for the things that you find valuable, and you tend to leave out of the gathering of sense data things that you don't find particularly valuable. And so we are not living in this creation of a reality that actually maps onto what's happening. I say this often enough, but in the West, of course, we're very Aristotelian in the way that we understand reality. And in that point of view, we do a universal gathering of the data around us, which is neutral. And then we create an internal working model of that from what we've gathered. And we operate in the world from that working model. And in the East, in the Buddhist formulation of this, we do a highly curated selection of the things that matter to us. We leave everything else out. We assign meaning to it, and then we live in this almost dreamlike tableau of meaning that we create. So my experience, of course, or you would gather from the way that I'm opinionated about this, that the second choice is better for me than the first choice. I've never really felt like I had any idea of what was going on, but I sure know what it means to So in that creation of the gathering, right? Visual experience, auditory experience, the felt sense of the body, taste and smell. Smell is so evocative of the past, in a sense. And then we take that undifferentiated experience and we evaluate it for urgency. Do we need to get to it right away? Neutral? Do we ever really need to get to it? And then is there time for a pleasant experience? And the brain science on this is pretty good. It takes about 3/8 of a second to process something that's categorized as urgent. It takes about a half a second to process something that's pleasant, which is why we say if there's time for a pleasant experience, because uh, the urgent stuff jumps to the head of the queue, and there is a kind of bottleneck in terms of processing and creating reality. The urgent stuff jumps to the head of the queue, so and because it's at 3/8 of a second instead of a half a second, sometimes it's possible to not experience anything positive, even though the environment is still filled with what might be considered positive experiences, just because of the way that we make things solid and meaningful. Then, if there's a thread of memory that is similar enough in its form that it matches the conception or the gathering, then that meaning attaches and it rolls into conceptual reality. So you have ultimate reality, which is the sense data, and you have conceptual reality, which is the defined meaning of that. And you can tell the difference between whether you're in the sense experience or in the tableau of meaning that you assign by the quality of detail to it. So for instance, if you're a seeing person and you look around the room and everything looks sharp and everything has detail to it wherever you look, then you are actually in the mental projection of what's there and not in the sensing experience of it, because visual experience is focused and detailed only in the very center of the sight space, and all of the rest of the sight space is less detailed and less focused. so that you would notice that. If you switch, if you can practice switching out of the tableau into the sense experience, then you would notice, for instance, the edge of my sight space is where my hands are, but I have really no detail at all of the hands. I have a sense that they're there. And then as I move them in, they're not in focus, they're not really detailed until they get to about here. Then there's more detail. The sound experience, can you hear the sound without making it into something? For instance, can you hear the sound of my voice as a vibration without making it into words and assigning meaning to it? This is that rapid habit of creating reality that we're in. Do you find the temperature of the air around you pleasant? Is it too warm? Is it too cold? All of those things are the meaning assigned to the sensing experience. So if you would ask how the ideal parent figure works, your visualizing experience, which is then remembered, which means it's made as an entry into the database. And because when the sensing experience gets to the top of the queue and it's compared to the database, if there's an entry in the database which is different than what you've habitually used, you can use that to assign meaning to the present moment so that when it rolls into conceptual reality, you've created a different reality than you would have created before. Is that making sense? Now, you say it's imaginary. And yes, correct, it's imaginary. One of the things about the human condition is that we don't come with a set of data. We come sort of a tabla, what do they call it? A tabla, not a tabla rasa, but a blank slate. And and we begin to gather and remember experiences. If you follow that all the way through, so if there's a capacity to sense and an object that meet, there's contact of a sensing experience, there's a consciousness of that. It's evaluated for urgency. Does it need immediate attention? Does it not matter? If we get to it, is there time for a pleasant experience? Then it's put into a queue for comparison to the perceptual database. And if there's a meaning that's close enough to the perceptual database, then that whole meaning thread attaches. And then rolls into conceptual reality. If that happens, of course, we are experiencing the present moment, but it's informed with this rich legacy of meaning of all of the times that we've experienced it before, unless it's a novel experience and we don't have an entry in the database that matches. And then the imagination kicks in and attempts to find meaning in the present moment. Part of that process then is the intention and the action that you will take. And once you've taken the action, the gathering of what happens in response to that action, which is all remembered as part of the experience that you've just had. If it's a novel experience, of course, the intention and action you're calculating, and there is no history of outcomes, so there's no expectations. I think one of the reasons I really like novel experiences for myself is I don't have any expectations of how it's going to turn out, so that that automatic limiting process that can happen with these built-in responses to things doesn't engage, and I'm free to actually have outcomes that I've not experienced before. This is, of course, true of any moment, but we can get so caught up in samsara and the habitual response to things that we exclude knowledge of anything that isn't actually in our capacity to imagine. Is that making sense? So much of the nature of that database and those entries and that meaning being assigned to the present moment includes our expectation of what can happen. And because in each moment what opens up is all of the possibilities that we could choose in response to the experience of the present moment, and a vast array of possibilities. But if we get very habitual in it, we simply go over and over again for the ones that we recognize, and we let all of the other ones fall away. The imagination is meant to solve all these things. Of course, then you have an experience that's actually happened, and you can gather the results of that, and that's added to the database. So what was a novel experience after a couple of times becomes something that has a history of entries in the database, and it can feel quite familiar. In fact, we can get lost in a kind of automatic processing of things that are uh, similar or too similar. Have you ever driven yourself home and not remembered the trip because you were lost in thought, because the there's so little novelty left to the trip back and forth that you didn't even pay attention to it? With the self, of course, we make now a distinction between the activity of you and the capacity, the part of you that can actually experience what you're doing. We often can get confused about that and think that the witness experience is actually the thing that's causing all of these things to happen and making all of these decisions, but it's not making any of them. It's just watching what happens. It has, I like to call it the veto function. If you recognize in that uh, slender sliver of time that you have to stop yourself from engaging in an action that this is going to really turn out badly, you can interrupt it. Have you ever caught yourself in the middle of a sentence, looking at the face of the person reacting to what you're saying, and realized you can't finish the sentence? Just chop it off and add a different ending to it in an attempt to save the day. Um, the thing about the ideal parent figure protocol is that you're visualizing something that's directed. So there is a lot of activity of self, and it's quite involved in memory. Uh, One of the things that happens in childhoods that are adverse is we begin to interfere with the capacity of memory, and we begin to interfere with the capacity of imagination. Oftentimes in childhood, when over and over again we imagine things that we want, but we can't get them, we begin to restrict the imagination so that we don't imagine that we can have those things. That's one of the most difficult conditionings to overcome, that you restrict your imagination so that you can't imagine the things that you wanted that you couldn't get. And that persists from childhood into adulthood. So you continue not to be able to imagine the things that you might want, or the explorations that you might want to do, because it was too painful in childhood. But the conditions of childhood are not the conditions of your adult life, and you have way more agency, way more self-efficacy. But if you don't attend to removing the restrictions on the imagination, it's hard for you to understand what it is that you should be doing with this one wild and precious life that you have. And so you don't explore in a way that you might. Uh, Mudit?
Hey, George, I realize that it's not so much restricting the imagination. In my
Mhm.
experience, it's like developing the whole thing from scratch. I sometimes feel the skill was not developed, but you have to develop it. It's not there, uh,
Right.
and I don't have to like remove the block. Like usually we say remove the blockages, it's already there. But in imagination case, it's like you have to build it.
Well, um, I might parse it as two things. One is the capacity to imagine, and one is the skill of imagining. So that the capacity to imagine is there, but if you haven't developed the skill of it, it seems almost as if you can't do it. And part of it is also listening deeply for the things that you wanted. Uh, some childhood experiences are such that the things that you wanted you couldn't get, and so you don't imagine that you can get them now. And you weren't wrong about the original experience. You couldn't get them. But what hasn't changed in your thinking process is that now is different from them and the conditions might be different. We can easily identify this as I'm not, I can't have this. I'm not, whatever it is, attractive or smart or capable, whatever it is that we think about ourselves that limits that. Um, and so we don't imagine it. And part of this process then is to imagine it, of course. What comes with the imagining of it is also the terrible sadness of not having been able to have it. And sometimes what comes with it is, I like to call it bittersweet, but some people think of it as just bitter, that it wasn't your innate capacity that limited you. It was your belief that it wasn't for you. That's the bitter part. The sweet part, of course, is if you can remove those obstacles, you can have it now. But that doesn't mean that the time before wasn't lost. It was. That's also one of the things that's so difficult to really be able to relate to, is that there's a lot of loss in uh, early conditioning, and it's not a simple loss. It's a compound loss in the sense that the things that didn't happen early then didn't set up the conditions for other things that might have happened, and that whole cascade didn't happen. And there's no way to get it now. And so often what happens to us is that we're overwhelmed by the experience of that loss, overwhelmed by the experience of that terrible sadness. And so we are actually not avoiding imagining, we're avoiding the sadness that interferes with that from happening. Is that making sense? I know it's kind of a long answer. And so you begin to imagine, and you begin to just let the mind take you where you want to, and hopefully tuning into the things that you have long longed for. Longing, of course, in secure functioning relationships is a great energy because it propels you to connect, and in insecure and disorganized relationships, longing is a sorrowful experience because it really suggests that you can't get it. So, for instance, dismissing people tend to experience longing as sadness and shame, and preoccupied people tend to experience longing as fear and guilt, rather than as this energy that will lead to satisfying connection. That makes sense. And disorganized people often experience longing as the onset of danger, the onset of if they give into it, being harmed by somebody, because that's the experience of their childhood. So we need to transform that, right? All of these things need to be transformed, and as you do it in the ideal parent figure protocol, of course, you begin to, by imagining ideal parents, and some people actually have so little reference for positive parents that it's not really possible for them to do that, and so we have a default of the ideal self, an ideal version of yourself now that is able to take care of the child self. But if you can move in the direction of an ideal parent figure, it is allowing yourself the understanding of what you longed for as a child in the way that you wanted to be taken care of. And then you begin to construct these ideal parent figures, and you use them to visualize ideal care. The thing about a visualization, of course, is that it's remembered, and it's remembered in the perceptual database. And so the next time that you go to form reality, you can use the imagined, visualized experience as a reference for defining the experience of the present moment, the same way that you could use something that actually happened. And you might say, well, it's a fantasy. It's not even substantial. It's pretend. But the thing about the nature of the human condition is that it's designed to be able to use the imagination to construct reality and then to take action as a result of that, because we need some capacity to adapt to novel experience. So there's no contradiction in saying that you can imagine something. You can imagine something ideal, and you can use that ideal fantasy as a basis for reality. You can form your intention and take your action based on that. And if you do, what happens is you've created an actual experience which is then remembered and stored in a similar place in the database, which means over time, you're not using that imagined piece as the basis of your experience. You're using actual experience and actual outcomes as the basis of defining the meaning of the present moment. Is that making sense? There is a lot of aspects to conditioning and the way that all of that comes to inform how you respond. One of the major areas of work is around our expectation of what can happen. It can be very limiting. If you have, for instance, in childhood, the experience of rejection, it's very easy and almost unnoticeable that you create your expectation of what could happen as a kind of rejecting experience. But in creating the expectation of rejection, you also create a defensiveness in the way that you engage in the experience of the world. And while you may not think that other people can pick up on your experience of self-rejection, it's actually quite apparent when somebody is anticipating rejection in the way that they manifestly ask that they're making. It's defensive, and it's often there's an anger spin to it because they're mad that they're being rejected, even though you're not rejecting them yet, because they haven't even made the ask. Right? Have to wait and see. I like to say, let other people reject you. Don't do all that hard work for yourself. Because who knows, they might not, right? They might actually accept what it is you have in mind. Would it?
And in what ways were you saying this? Like, in what ways are the person rejected? That's his own perception, right?
Well, I was sitting with somebody the other day. It was a group of maybe 6 people, uh, and it seemed to me that one of them had interpreted an exchange as rejecting, and then over the course of the next half hour, their participation fell away, and their answers went from full sentences to 1 or 2 words, and there was an intense anger that came from it as well. And it was apparent that nobody else had understood what the rejecting event had been, only that that they felt completely ostracized in the group, even though the rest of us did not have a good understanding of what had happened that had caused that. But there also wasn't a way to repair it um, because of the defensiveness that uh, came up in the other person. And at a certain point, you end up feeling quite helpless, or at least that's how I ended up feeling, quite helpless to do anything about it. And you know, a group dynamic is quite different than a one-on-one dynamic. But it also would have been hijacking to have the whole group focus on uh, that, and so that didn't happen.
So you're saying it did happen, but the group didn't have any idea what
Well,
the
the the person had the experience of being rejected, but I couldn't tell you what happened that caused that experience to happen. But I could, well, at least that's how I read the situation. That by the end of the evening, they were so angry at all of us for having rejected them. But even though there was dozens of entries for entreaties for them to rejoin the conversation. So, but it looks like what I call self-rejection. You just reject yourself somehow. You think you can't have it, or you think something happened.
oh, self-rejection. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that's self-rejection.
Yeah,
If I pick up on you doing something and I say, oh, this person is doing something to reject me, that's self-rejection.
right. That's why I say let them reject you, so that it's really clear that that's what they're doing, rather than do it for yourself. Because you could easily, you know, you make reality, that is to say, you make meaning, you don't make reality, you make meaning, and you can assign rejection to it as easily as you can assign anything else.
The group will not tell you that, hey, I reject you. I mean, it's eventually the same thing. The group, like a person doesn't intentionally reject anybody else, right? Or they don't.
Well, yeah, I didn't think that there was any intention to reject. And I didn't even think that what they had contributed was unwelcome. It was interesting, in the conversation then moved to the next thing the way that conversations do. Um, but I did notice they got madder and madder, and their answers got shorter and shorter, and their participation got less and less until they were just scowling. I'm laughing, but it was actually kind of painful and heartbreaking that that happened. Christian?
So I guess in that case, the like, I don't know, maybe this isn't always possible for someone that's feeling that way, but if you like are interpreting rejection, then like the antidote or whatever would be to ask rather than like assuming, and then you can find out. Which maybe that sounds like a really simplistic answer,
Well,
but
I would say that we did ask, and the answer was fine.
okay. Sorry, I mean for the person feeling rejected if
Oh,
they're capable of asking. But I guess I am curious about
yes, you know, and
how, like how to
that well, finish.
I guess I'm just curious how if someone tends to self-reject and they kind of haven't built that skill to like break through that difficult barrier, that their own defense mechanism, then where does the breakthrough come from? I mean, obviously like IPF and
Yes.
mentalizing work, but do I guess you're saying maybe the group couldn't do anything in that format to break through.
Well, in a group dynamic, of course, the whole group could have turned the attention to the one person and tried to attend to it. But that's a violation of Grice's, right? It's an unfair demand of a group uh, to do that. and could easily be experienced by the rest of the group as manipulation for attention. In a dynamic you have an obligation to hold up your part of the conversation. If it's like hacky sack is the best metaphor for that. If somebody kicks the little hacky sack to you, your agreement is to kick it back, not to hold on to it or let it fall, right? That's the agreement of a conversation. So, well, it doesn't, somebody could actually say no, right? If you made a request to them, and that would not be necessarily self-rejection. I'm reading a chat. Paul.
Thank you, George. To switch back maybe to an earlier comment or topic, just about the way that the visualizations, using the imagination, actively using our imagination in the ideal parent figure protocol meditations and following someone's guidance on it. Just going to, in terms of like the felt sense encoding, I've gotten the impression from doing this for a while, by 5 or 6 months of working with someone who an integrative attachment therapist who does them. There's a lot of emphasis on getting a felt sense in the body of what it is like. And I'm wondering if that is supportive, essentially in like encoding a valuable memory, if you will, into the range of possibilities that might get called up, or if you have anything more to comment on. And I'm sort of laying this alongside, I heard you make a comment about in terms of things longed for that were really desired in childhood, but rarely present, rarely offered or provided or found. And I'm kind of, tapping into, there's some huge, I guess, somatic component for myself, and I hear others talk about this too. Like when you're in the moment of the existential crisis of not getting your need met, a lot of it's like this, whatever your body does, your mind is doing something too. But along the letting your mind kind of go where it wants in the imagining, any kind of thoughts, guidance, suggestion on how much to try to go, well, what does it feel like?
Well, I think that the feeling marker is really important all the way along. But when you look at the way that we make the experience of reality, particularly in the visualization sense of it, it's internal visual thinking, it's internal auditory thinking, it's emotion in the body, and also the felt sense of the physical body. And those 4 aspects come together to create the perception of something being real. If you open the eyes, of course, and have the external soundscape on, that creates more of a sense of the world. But because the visualization is more internal, always marking the felt sense of the body when you get someplace good also helps to boost the capacity to remember it, because human memory requires a strong emotional component in order for it to be remembered. So I think of it as marking when you get somewhere in the visualization that you want to.
I mean, just to maybe, I don't know, add a thought out loud, see if you or anyone else thinks this. I mean, it sounds like it's almost like a really fertile ground for anyone experienced in insight meditation, and that it's kind of like you're making the different sense objects, if you will, of the imagination, objects of meditation.
Right, indeed.
Yeah, the felt sense, the sight, the sound, the smell, whatever it is, right? And it probably supports encoding them because you're making meaning. There's some emotionally important thing going on. You're imagining getting your needs met. So the hippocampus and the amygdala are hopefully lighting up and actually encoding them.
Yes, indeed.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that.
So, and from the meditation side of it, of course, if you're the Vipassana side, of course, is splitting everything up and watching the individual pieces and keeping them together in that moment of marking. Yeah. Essential. So then I think really where the change begins to come is that you begin to make reality based on the visualization, and then you use the visualization, which creates an actual experience, and then the actual experience is remembered. And over time, of course, you're no longer depending on the visualization at all, really, for that vein. You're actually only counting on things that have actually happened to you. One of the interesting things about this is that the self experience stays largely the same because it isn't what's being affected by this process, particularly. You're witnessing in the same way that you've always witnessed, but what you're witnessing is you're responding differently than you've responded before. And that's really the place where this bittersweet quality comes in. You're responding differently, although the self experience isn't different. You're witnessing something different. You're witnessing you do something differently. But it hasn't been created by the self experience. The self experience is just witnessing it in the way that it always does, which leads to this insight, maybe, that it wasn't your innate capacity that was the problem. It was that you couldn't create a reality where you could do it, which is and then it opens up this recollection of the different times when you didn't make the decision that you're now able to make, which produces a terrible sadness, I think, for a lot of people. But then, of course, you can do it now, which opens it up. And so there's this piece about integrating that aspect of it so that you don't spend time attempting to go back and recreate experiences that have already been lost, that you can just let them be lost and move ahead into what is possible now. So in some sense, there's no need to go buy the train set that you always wanted when you were 9, because you're not 9 anymore. And all of the things that would have cascaded from that did not cascade and will not cascade because it's already lost. And to allow the sadness of that and not need to avoid the sadness of that so that you can be free of it rather than have to continually avoid it. There's a phrase in English called "what might have been." I don't know if you've heard it. It encapsulates that kind of rueful sadness about it. And I think also that if you don't really reflect on it that much if you move forward, because you're engaged in the things that are available to you now, the things that you find meaningful now. And so the things that were not available to you in the past that you did not have don't matter so much because they're actually associated with the past. That makes sense. The process also is one of exploration, and exploration is really the main place where we derive meaningfulness in our life. And so what we want to be able to do is explore in the primary sense of finding meaning. And then most of us are going to have to do some kind of secondary exploration to gather the time, energy, and resources to be able to do it. And we're going to need a secure base in which to explore from, which is that network of people that you need in order to be able to do it. That makes sense. And so the main aspect on the attachment side is to be able to put together these social networks that are going to be able to support your exploration in a meaningful way. And so the learning of the dynamics of secure functioning relationships and the mentalization and emotional regulation to be able to support those, and of course the reworking of the perceptual database so that you can train the body mind to respond in an automatic way to support these relationships, which really are the thing that are necessary to support the exploration. That's the whole process of it. But the way the visualization really works, just to do a quick summing, is you create entries into the perceptual database that you can use as a basis for creating the meaning of the present moment. And you create alternative, secure meanings so that you don't rely on the conditioned, insecure, disorganized attachment system in the way that you create the present moment. And then you flow in the way that you respond to the experience of the present moment. The process of just learning the dynamics of secure functioning relationships and attempting to modify your agreements with people does work, but it's not automatic. It's manual. And we're really trying to move in that direction of the automaticity of it. So you're just able to be, as I like to say, freely authentic in your expression. Shall we do some meditation? What would you like to do? How did that go? Good. So let's see. On Saturday is the second of the Meditation and Addiction series. We'll be talking about the second and third modules, stress, anger, and depression, and persistent negative emotions as conduits for relapse. Addiction is of interest to you. Oops. Take a look at that. I think that we have a level 2 meditation and attachment starting in February. If you're interested in that, that's a 6-month class around the 3-pillar approach. It's mainly focusing on the second and third pillar, but there is some basic instruction, like we just did here on the first pillar. What else is coming up? Anyway, whatever is coming up, it's on the website and you can take a look at it. I think there's a few of the classes that are open for registration. Take a look at that. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that if you're resourced and you can make a donation, you will. There's links on the website to make a donation. Any amount is helpful to us. It supports me and also the work that Mettagroup is doing. It's really nice to see you. I hope to see you again soon, somewhere along the path. See you later. Bye.